He looked less like a senator and more like a small-town parish priest. The kind of man who knew the names of every parishioner's children and could tell you the score of the high school football game from a decade ago. His suit, a simple, unassuming charcoal gray, seemed to hang on his frame with a comfortable familiarity, not the sharp-tailored precision of Washington power. Senator John Kennedy sat alone at the witness table, a picture of placid patience. He adjusted his spectacles, the fluorescent lights of the Senate Judiciary Committee room glinting off the lenses, and took a slow, deliberate sip of water. The room was a tinderbox of anticipation, a suffocating mix of stale air, expensive perfume, and the low, electric hum of 100 cameras waiting for a spark. Reporters whispered into their microphones, their voices a restless murmur. Kennedy, however, seemed utterly immune to the tension. He appeared to be a man waiting for a bus, not a political tempest, but beneath that calm, almost folksy exterior, a different kind of energy coiled. It was the focused stillness of a master chess player who had already seen the board 5 moves ahead. Who knew that his opponent, blinded by her own perceived power, was about to walk directly into a checkmate she could never have anticipated. He had spent 3 years preparing for this single morning, weaving a web of facts so dense and so damning that escape would be impossible. He glanced at the heavy FBI sealed binder before him. Its stark red, lettering a silent promise of the devastation to come. He knew what was in it. He knew the bank statements, the wiretaps, the sworn affidavit. He knew the names, the dates, and the dollar amounts. And he knew that the woman about to storm through the doors believed none of it could ever touch her. The distant percussive clang of gold on wood echoed down the marble corridor, a sound that acted as an overture for the chaos to follow. It was the sound of Maxine Waters's personal gavel, a prop she carried not for order, but for intimidation. It was her royal scepter, and she was the queen of her own traveling court of outrage. She strode at the center of a human vortex, a phalanx of 20 staffers and security personnel who moved with the practiced choreography of a royal procession. At 84, she moved with a furious energy, a kinetic storm of performative anger that had been her primary currency in the Capitol for over 40 years. She checked the time, not on a simple watch, but on a gold and diamond monstrosity that wrapped around her wrist like a glittering manacle. A piece of jewelry that cost more than the annual salary of the constituents she claimed to represent. 9:23 a.m. She was late, but that was the point. Punctuality was for the powerless. Let the country lawyer from Louisiana wait. Let him stew in the oppressive silence of the committee room. Let him understand that in her Washington she was the sun and everyone else orbited her schedule. Is he nervous? She barked to her chief of staff, her voice a loud, growly instrument designed to carry. He should be. I'm about to teach that folksy fraud what it means to challenge a real fighter. Her entourage, a mix of young, idealistic true believers and seasoned cynical opportunists, chuckled on cue. Every detail of her presentation was a calculated act of psychological warfare. Her suit was a brilliant, almost violent shade of purple, the color of royalty and power. Her wig, a towering architectural marvel of sculpted hair, added inches to her height and a regal severity to her silhouette. The dozen gold bangles on her arm were not just decoration. They were an auditory weapon, clanging with every gesture, demanding focus, punctuating her pronouncements with the sound of wealth. She paused just outside the committee room doors, turning to her personal photographer. "Get the shot, Marcus," she commanded. "I want to see the fear in his eyes when I walk in." She then turned to her followers, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Remember, when I point, you start the chant. Hands off, Maxine, loud and clear. We're going to drown him out before he even opens his mouth." Smash that like button and subscribe to the channel because you are about to witness a masterclass in political annihilation. With a final theatrical flourish, she shoved the heavy oak doors open and burst into the room. The wave of camera flashes was blinding, a silent explosion of light. As planned, Her entourage began their chant, a rhythmic, aggressive roar that violated every rule of Senate decorum. Hands off Maxine! Hands off Maxine! Senators on the dais looked up, their faces a mixture of shock and weary resignation. This was not a hearing. It was a hostile takeover. Waters marched directly to the witness table, ignoring the empty chair designated for her. She stood over John Kennedy, a predator sizing up her prey, and slammed her gavel down on the polished wood, the crack echoing like a gunshot in the suddenly silent room. This hearing is now under the control of the people, she declared, her voice booming, and I am here to expose the right-wing conspiracy against me. Kennedy didn't flinch. He slowly looked up from his notes, his expression not of fear, but of mild curiosity, as if observing a particularly exotic and noisy bird. His Louisiana drawl, when it came, was soft, yet it cut through the lingering chants with surgical precision. Good morning, Congresswoman. I do believe you're mistaken. This is a Senate hearing, not a political rally, and you're not here to conduct an investigation. You're here to be the subject of one. A wave of derisive laughter erupted from Maxine Waters. It was a harsh practice sound honed over decades of deflecting and dominating. She pointed a long manicured finger directly at Kennedy's face, the gold bangles on her wrist clattering like a rattlesnake's warning. The subject of one child. Please, you think your little backwoods theatrics can intimidate me? I've been breaking Republicans like you since before you could spell your own name. You work for me. The people put me here. And I am the voice of the voiceless, the shield of the oppressed. You seem to have forgotten that. She turned away from him, playing to the bank of cameras, her natural audience. Her voice swelled with righteous indignation, a familiar key she had played to perfection for 40 years. This man, this so-called country lawyer, thinks he can come to Washington and lecture me on procedure. He thinks he can hide his extremist agenda behind a Foley accent and a cheap suit. I don't have time for your swamp stories and your falsy little act. I'm here to fight for my people against this racist, sexist, right-wing witch hunt. The performance was vintage Waters. Turned the accusation back on the accuser, wrap herself in the mantle of victimhood, and framed the entire proceeding as an attack on the community she claimed to represent. Her remaining entourage, emboldened by her defiance, tried to restart their chant, a few scattered voices crying out, "Hands off Maxine." Kennedy remained perfectly still, letting her tirade wash over him. He waited for the last echo of her voice to fade, creating a pocket of silence that felt more powerful than her shouting. He adjusted his glasses with the slow, deliberate motion of a man who had all the time in the world. Well, ma'am, I do appreciate you finally gracing us with your presence. And you're right about one thing. I'm just a simple country lawyer. Waters scoffed, a smirk spreading across her face. Finally, some honesty. A simple man who is completely out of his depth. Kennedy's expression didn't change, but his eyes, magnified slightly by his spectacles, held a glint of steel. A simple country lawyer, he continued, his voice as smooth and steady as the Mississippi River, who happened to graduate with honors from Vanderbilt, studied law at the University of Virginia, and then went on to become a scholar at Magdalen College, Oxford. A ripple of murmuring went through the press corps. The simple country lawyer narrative, a persona Kennedy himself cultivated, was being gently but firmly corrected. The chanting from her entourage faltered, dying out in confusion. Waters's smirk tightened at the edges. This was not part of her script. I also practiced constitutional law for nearly 30 years before the people of Louisiana did me the honor of sending me to this chamber. Kennedy added, his tone still conversational. But you're right, I'm not a Washington insider. And that's why I had to ask for some help to understand how things really work up here. He paused, letting the anticipation build, then reached down and placed his hand on the thick FBI sealed binder. So today, I've invited a few friends to join us. Some folks from the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. They've been conducting a quiet little inquiry for the past 3 years. Operation Homecoming, they call it. And Congresswoman, you are its star. The transformation in Maxine Waters's face was a sight to behold. The mask of arrogant defiance didn't just crack. It shattered. For a split second, captured in glorious high definition by a dozen cameras. Raw, unfiltered panic flashed in her eyes. The blood seemed to drain from her face, leaving her carefully applied makeup looking like a garish parody. FBI, she stammered, the word catching in her throat. She tried to recover to summon the old fire. FBI works for the Justice Department, and I will have their budget zeroed out. You think you can investigate me? I'm a ranking member of Congress. I have oversight over you. Kennedy nodded agreeably as if she were making a perfectly reasonable point. Yes, ma'am. 32 years in Congress. That's a long time. A long time to build a legacy. He opened the binder. The sound of the metal ring snapping open was unnervingly loud in the silent room. Let's take a look at what you've been building. Waters, in a pure instinctual flight response, turned toward the main doors, perhaps intending to make a dramatic exit. But her path was blocked. 2 men dressed in nondescript dark suits, but with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents, had quietly and professionally positioned themselves in front of the exit. They weren't threatening. They didn't move. They simply stood, their presence a silent, immovable declaration that the rules of the game had changed. There would be no escape. She spun around, her eyes darting to the other exits, only to see the same quiet, solid presence at each one. The room, which moments ago had been her stage, had just become her cage. Her voice rose to a near scream, the raw edge of panic slicing through her words. This is a setup. This is a political ambush. This is fascism. Kennedy's voice remained placid, but it carried a new edge of authority. Ma'am, in federal proceedings, that's called intimidating a witness. That's strike one. I'd advise you to take a seat. We have a great deal to discuss. Take a seat. The words exploded from Maxine Waters. A shriek of pure undiluted outrage. The sheer audacity of the suggestion seemed to momentarily short-circuit her brain. She, Maxine Waters, a living icon, a congressional titan, was being told to sit down like a disobedient schoolgirl. I will not take a seat. I demand my privileges. I have special elevator access. I have a security detail. You cannot hold me here. Her voice, which had commanded rallies and silenced opponents for decades, was now shrill and ragged, teetering on the edge of hysteria. The gold bangles on her wrist jangled wildly as she gestured, not with authority, but with a frantic, desperate energy. The room watched, utterly captivated. This was no longer a hearing. It was a public vivisection. Kennedy, unmoved by the outburst, replied with the same infuriating calm. Not today, ma'am. Today, your privileges are suspended. Today you are not a ranking member of Congress. You are simply a witness in a federal criminal investigation. Operation Homecoming. It has a nice ring to it, don't you think? A project dedicated to discovering what happens when a public servant stops serving the public and starts serving herself. Waters looked desperately toward the dais, her eyes scanning the faces of her Democratic colleagues, silently pleading for an intervention, for someone to stand up and denounce this charade. But she found no saviors. Senators who had once clamored for a foe with her were now intensely fascinated by their own notes. Eyes that once sought her approval were now fixed firmly on their desks. In the brutal calculus of Washington, the scent of blood was in the water, and no one wanted to be splashed when the feeding frenzy began. Her gaze swept the room, searching for any friendly face, and landed on her entourage. The very people who had chanted her name just minutes before. They were no longer a proud phalanx, but a scattered, nervous herd, inching away from her, trying to blend into the wallpaper. Their faces, once full of righteous fervor, were now pale with dawning horror. They were realizing they had chained themselves to a sinking ship. My supporters, she declared, her voice cracking. There are thousands of them outside. They will storm this building. They will not let you do this." It was a desperate, hollow threat, and Kennedy knew it. He calmly pressed a button on the laptop connected to the large screens behind him. The screens, which had been displaying the Senate seal, flickered to life, showing a live multi-panel feed from news helicopters hovering over the Dirksen Senate office building. There were indeed protesters outside, hundreds of them, but their signs were not what Waters had expected. They didn't say, "Hands off Maxine." They read, "Anti-Max wears money and Congress is not an ATM." And most damningly, Hawk Park PRI South LASVIC. The screen then split. On the left, it showed the live feed of the angry protesters. On the right, it cycled through a series of stark, brutal images. First, a photograph of a dilapidated street in her Los Angeles district scarred with boarded-up storefronts, sprawling homeless encampments, and the visible decay of generational poverty. Then that image was replaced by a glossy sun-drenched photo of a magnificent $4.5 million mansion. A sprawling palace of terracotta and ivy nestled in the opulent tree-lined enclave of Hancock Park. An interesting juxtaposition, wouldn't you agree, Congresswoman? Kennedy mused, his voice dripping with mock intellectual curiosity. The people you represent living in squalor while you reside in a palace fit for a king. But I suppose I'm getting ahead of myself. We have to build our case methodically. Waters stared at the screen, her mouth slightly agape. The sight of her own constituents protesting against her, their faces contorted with the same anger she had taught them to direct at others, seemed to stun her into silence. She tried to bang her gavel again, a desperate, reflexive attempt to regain control. But her hand was trembling so violently that the blow was weak and ineffectual. "Reclaiming my time," she croaked, the phrase that had been her signature weapon now sounding like a pathetic plea. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, but losing none of its penetrating power. "Ma'am, you cannot reclaim time that was never yours to begin with. That time belonged to the people of your district, and it seems they've come to collect." He picked up a single document from his binder, its edges crisp and precise. "Now, let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about a bank. A very special bank. A bank called One United." The name hung in the air, thick and heavy. The room was now so quiet you could hear the software whir of the cameras as they zoomed in on Waters's face. The last vestiges of her defiance seemed to crumble, replaced by a stark, chilling dread. Her entourage had completely dissolved, its members melting away through side doors, abandoning their queen to face the executioner alone. Kennedy looked up from the document, his gaze locking onto hers, those deceptively mild eyes now holding the cold, hard certainty of a hanging judge. "You remember One United Bank, don't you, ma'am? The bank your husband just happened to have a major stake in. The bank that was on the verge of collapse before you decided to personally rescue it with taxpayer money. All while the homes of your own constituents were being foreclosed on." Waters's hand, still clutching the gavel, began to shake uncontrollably. A small, almost imperceptible crack appeared in the polished wood of the gavel head. The symbol of her power was beginning to break. Maxine Waters stood frozen, trapped in the harsh glare of the hearing room lights. The name One United Bank echoed in the cavernous space, a death knell for the career she had so carefully constructed. Her personal gavel, now a dead weight in her trembling hand, felt alien and useless. The FBI agents at the doors were statues of quiet menace, their very presence a suffocating reminder that this was no longer a political debate, but a criminal proceeding. Senator Kennedy's voice, still deceptively gentle, continued its relentless assault. "One United Bank," he repeated, letting the name settle, "a cornerstone of the community. You called it one of the nation's largest black-owned banks, a noble institution on the surface." Waters finally found her voice, though it was a thin, reedy version of its former self, stripped of its booming authority. "I have always been a champion of minority-owned businesses. It is my duty to support them." Her words sounded hollow, A pre-recorded defense played back on a failing system. "Oh, indeed you have, Congresswoman," Kennedy agreed with an unnerving pleasantness. He slid a document out from the binder and placed it under the overhead projector. A financial disclosure statement materialized on the large screens. This shows that in 2008, as the global financial system was teetering on the brink of collapse, your husband, Mr. Sidney Williams, held a significant position in One United stock, approximately $350 worth to be precise. And at that precise moment, the bank was insolvent. It was drowning in bad loans and mismanagement. It was, by every objective measure, about to die. Kennedy looked up, his gaze piercing. But One United had an advantage that thousands of other small banks across America did not. It had an ace in the hole. It had you. Waters tried to rally to summon the old fire. "I fought for all minority institutions during the crisis," she declared, attempting to bang the gavel for emphasis. But her trembling hand and the growing crack in the wood turned the gesture into a pathetic display of weakness. The sharp crack she intended came out as a dull, splintering thud. "You certainly fought for this one," Kennedy countered, his voice seamless. "On September 9, 2008, you made a phone call. Not a staffer, not a formal letter through committee channels. You personally picked up the phone and called the office of Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson." As he spoke, a new image filled the screens. A verbatim transcript of the call sourced from Treasury Department records. The stark typewritten words seemed to indict her more than any accusation could. The call lasted 17 minutes. Kennedy narrated, his voice a calm counterpoint to the damning text on the screen. "You pleaded, you cajoled, you insisted that One United was too important to fail. And you said something very interesting. You said, and I quote from the official transcript, 'This has nothing to do with my husband's financial stake. This is about saving a pillar of the black community.'" Kennedy paused, letting the quote hang in the air. "It's always a curious thing, isn't it, when someone preemptively denies the very thing they stand accused of?" The elaborate wig on Waters's head seemed to shift as she shook her head. A gesture of frantic denial. That bank was vital. It provided services no one else would. Oh, it provided a service to someone. "All right," Kennedy conceded. "Let's see who." Following your personal intervention, One United Bank received $12 million in TARP bailout funds. $12 million taxpayer dollars. He produced another document, this one bearing the seal of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. Now, here's the fascinating part. To qualify for TARP funds, banks had to meet a list of stringent financial health criteria. One United met exactly none of them. In fact, according to this internal FDIC review, it was rated as one of the most poorly managed and financially unsound institutions in the entire country. Bank executives were documented using corporate funds to purchase luxury cars, to throw lavish parties, to secure beachfront properties for themselves. Behavior that should have immediately disqualified them from receiving a single penny of taxpayer money. He looked directly at Waters, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. "But they got their $12 million. They got it because you, a powerful member of the House Financial Services Committee, made that call. You used the power entrusted to you by your constituents to rescue your husband's personal investment of $350. Waters swayed on her feet, her hand flying to the witness table to steady herself. "This is a lie, a racist attack on black success." Kennedy's voice suddenly dropped, losing all its Foley charm and taking on a tone of cold, righteous anger. "Ma'am, let me tell you about an attack on black success. In that same period, while you were busy saving your husband's stock portfolio, 250,000 families in your district faced foreclosure proceedings. While One United executives were enjoying their beach houses, your constituents, the very people who sent you here, were being thrown out of their homes. While you were on the phone with the Treasury Secretary, their life savings were being wiped out." The screens behind him changed again, now displaying a grim collage of foreclosure. notices and eviction statistics from South Loa's Angels. The numbers were stark and brutal. You didn't pick up the phone for them, did you, Congresswoman? You didn't personally intervene for the grandmother in Watts who lost the home she'd lived in for 50 years. You didn't fight for the small business owner in Compton whose dream was turning to dust. You fought for the bank that held your husband's money. He stood up his full height, casting a shadow over the witness table. In Louisiana, we have a saying, you can call a skunk a house cat, but it still stinks. Ma'am, you wrapped this stinking corrupt deal in the flag of community service. And you hoped no one would ever be brave enough to call out the smell. The air in the room was thick with the fallout from the one united accusation. Maxine Waters, who had entered with the force of a natural disaster, now seemed diminished, a storm that had blown itself out, leaving only wreckage behind. The crack in her gavel had widened, a visible metaphor for the fracturing of her authority. Her eyes, which had flashed with defiance, were now clouded with a dawning, terrifying understanding of her predicament. She was no longer the inquisitor. She was the prey. But Kennedy was not finished. He was merely moving to the next phase of his methodical demolition. He allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of the last revelation settle upon her before he began the next assault. How dare you? She finally whispered the words, a pale ghost of her earlier fury. She slammed the damaged gavel down again. And this time it happened. The head of the gavel split cleanly in two, one half clattering loudly across the polished floor, spinning to a stop near the feet of a stunned reporter. The sound was a final definitive punctuation mark on the end of her power. She was left holding a useless, broken stick. I have done more for my community than you could ever imagine. She shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. Let's talk about what you've done. Kennedy interrupted, his voice smooth and seamless, giving her no room to recover. Specifically, let's talk about what you've done for your own family. Let's talk about your daughter, Karen Waters. As he spoke, a new set of documents appeared on the screens, these bearing the seal of the Federal Election Commission. The camera operators, sensing the shift in attack, zoomed in tighter on Waters's face. Your daughter, Karen, is the proprietor of a business, Kennedy continued, his tone that of a teacher explaining a simple concept. It's called Progressive Connections. It has a very official, very important sounding name, doesn't it? One might imagine a bustling office, a team of political operatives, a hub of grassroots activity. He paused, letting the image form in the minds of the audience. We were curious about Progressive Connections, so we looked into its client list and we found it has only ever had one client. He looked directly at Waters. You, Congresswoman, for the last 15 years, the sole source of revenue for your daughter's company has been your own campaign committee. Waters gripped the broken handle of her gavel, her knuckles white. My daughter is a respected and successful businesswoman. Your daughter, Kennedy said, his voice flat and factual, has been paid over $750 by your campaign. $3 of $1 million funneled directly from your political donors into her personal bank account. And for what precisely? We looked at the invoices. A series of invoices now filled the screen detailing payments for Slate mailer management. Slate mailers, Kennedy explained, for the benefit of the public. Those are the sample ballots campaigns send out telling voters which candidates to support. According to these records, your daughter's one-woman home-based operation charged your campaign $35, sometimes more. For each of these mailers, Waters found a flicker of her old self. That is the fair market rate for a highly specialized service. She protested, but her voice lacked conviction. It was the desperate gambit of a bluffer holding a losing hand. Kennedy's chuckle was low and dangerous. Fair market rate, ma'am. We did our homework. We submitted the exact same project specifications to every major political consulting firm in Southern California. The highest quote we received for the same work was $5. Your daughter charged your campaign almost 7 times the going rate. That's not a markup, ma'am. That's a money laundering scheme disguised as a family business. He flipped to a new page in his binder. But why stop with your daughter? Let's talk about your son. Edward Waters. More records flashed on the screen. Over the years, your campaign has paid your son over $200 for strategic consulting. A very vague and impressive title. We subpoenaed his consulting reports. The proof of the work he did to earn that money. Would you like to see them? Kennedy held up a single pristine blank sheet of paper. There are none, because he never filed any. He never did any work. You paid your son $200 of your donor's money for doing absolutely nothing. The cumulative weight of the revelations was becoming unbearable. Waters began to hyperventilate, her chest rising and falling in ragged, shallow breaths. This is a lynching, she screamed, the words tearing from her throat. A high-tech lynching of a strong black woman and her family. Kennedy's face remained a mask of calm patience. Ma'am, the only thing being lynched here is the truth, and your family's appetite for public money seems to be insatiable. We're not done yet. Let's talk about your grandson. Waters's eyes widened in genuine shock. The attack was now spanning 3 generations. Mickle Moore, Kennedy said, the name dropping like a stone into a silent pool. Your grandson. Your campaign began paying him when he was just 16 years old. $50 over 2 years for youth outreach. A 16-year-old high school student making $25 a year from his grandmother's campaign funds. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. He looked her directly in the eye and delivered the line that would define the entire hearing. Congresswoman, your family treats the United States Congress like a personal ATM. The only difference is an ATM has a withdrawal limit. The ATM accusation hung in the air. A perfect, devastating summary of the morning's revelations. It was simple, brutal, and utterly memorable. The reporters in the room scribbled furiously. They knew they had their headline. For Maxine Waters, the blow was staggering. It reframed her entire career not as public service, but as a decadesal-long family enrichment scheme. She swayed, a great oak, finally succumbing to the axe. Her eyes, wide with panic, darted around the room, searching for a lifeline, a friendly face, an ally to stand up and stop the bleeding. Where is the leadership? She cried out. Her voice, a raw, desperate plea aimed at the Democratic side of the dais. Where is Nancy? Where is my party? Are you going to let him do this to me? Her appeal was met with a profound and terrifying silence. Her colleagues continued their intense study of the wood grain on their desks. In that moment, a small, almost imperceptible buzz sounded from the witness table. It was her smartphone. In her haste and panic, she had forgotten it was still synced to the room's audiovisual system from her staff's initial failed attempt to set up a presentation. A notification banner flashed across the giant screens for everyone to see. It was a text message from Nancy Pelosi. The message contained only 6 words. 6 words that acted as a political death sentence. Maxine, I don't know who that is. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a moment of such pure, cold-blooded political betrayal that even the most jaded reporters were shocked. The Speaker of the House, her longtime ally, was not just abandoning her. She was erasing her, pretending she didn't even exist. The blow was more visceral than any of Kennedy's accusations. It was personal. It was final. Waters stared at the screen, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. With a strangled cry, she snatched the phone and frantically stabbed at the screen, her trembling fingers barely able to hit the right buttons. In her panic, she hit the speakerphone icon. The entire room heard the call go through, heard the ringtone, and then heard the cold, impersonal voice of an automated system. The number you have dialed has been blocked at the customer's request. Blocked? Pelosi hadn't just ignored her. She had blocked her number. In a fit of uncontrollable rage and despair, Waters hurled the phone against the far wall where it shattered, scattering plastic and glass across the floor. No justice, no peace, she screamed, trying to rally the last vestiges of her power. Her voice cracking with emotion. Everyone with me. No justice. No peace. She looked toward the back of the room to where her entourage had once stood proud. Silence. Her own staff, her paid supporters, wouldn't even chant for her. They had vanished. Kennedy let the pathetic moment hang in the air, a testament to her complete and utter isolation. He then continued, his voice still maddeningly calm. Perhaps we should move on. Shall we discuss the network of shell companies you established in the Caribbean? Or maybe the exorbitant speaking fees from organizations that appear to have no employees and no offices? I demand a recess. Waters croaked, her voice almost gone. I need to consult with my counsel. I demand my rights. You have the right to remain silent. Ma'am, Kennedy said, his tone softening with something that almost sounded like pity. It might be the first time in your career you've chosen to exercise it. But it's a fine American right. As he spoke, a man stood up from the public gallery. It was Jerome, her chief of staff, the man who had been by her side for nearly a decade. He had not, in fact, fled the room. He had been sitting quietly, his face a mask of turmoil. With a look of grim resolution, he walked past the stunned security guards down the center aisle and approached Kennedy's table. Jerome, Waters cried, her voice breaking completely. What are you doing? Get back here. Jerome didn't look at her. He looked at Kennedy. Senator, he said, his voice clear and steady. My name is Jerome Thompson. I am Congresswoman Waters' chief of staff, and I would like to submit my testimony as a cooperating witness. The betrayal was absolute. If Pelosi's text was a political assassination, this was a dagger to the heart from a trusted son. Waters staggered backward as if struck by a physical blow, catching herself on the edge of the witness table. Et tu, Jerome, she whispered, the Shakespearean reference sounding utterly bizarre and pathetic in the modern hearing room. Ma'am, you just quoted Shakespeare, Kennedy observed with an air of mild surprise. Impressive. They must have taught the classics in between the corruption seminars. Jerome pulled a small worn notebook from his jacket pocket. Senator, I have kept a log for years. I have documented everything. The cash deliveries, the code words she used, the threats she made to anyone who questioned the finances. Code words? Kennedy prompted gently like a therapist encouraging a patient. Tell us about the code words. Jerome took a deep breath. When she wanted to arrange a cash pickup, she would say she had an appointment at the hair salon. That was the signal. When she said she needed to check on the community garden, that meant she was meeting with a lobbyist or a donor who wanted a political favor in exchange for an unregistered donation. Lies. Waters tried to scream, but the word came out as a strangled rasp. She grabbed the broken half of her gavel and banged it feebly on the table, producing only a dull, pathetic thud. And the cash? Kennedy asked. She kept it in shoeboxes. Jerome said, his voice filled with a mixture of shame and relief. Dozens of them, all designer brands. She used to joke that her Manilows and Louboutins were her real nest egg. I have photographs, Senator. She had me take them for her inventory. Jerome produced his phone, and a moment later, the screens behind Kennedy lit up with image after image of high-end shoeboxes overflowing with stacks of $100 bills. Each box was meticulously labeled in Waters' own handwriting. Community fund, salon money, walkout cash. The visual evidence was irrefutable. A garish and undeniable portrait of greed. The woman who had built a career on the rhetoric of poverty was literally hoarding cash in luxury shoeboxes. The images of the cash-filled shoeboxes burned on the screens. A vulgar monument to a career of graft. The labels in Maxine Waters' own looping script were a confession in plain sight. Walking around money, Kennedy mused, studying the photographs with the air of an anthropologist examining a bizarre tribal artifact. That's a colorful term. Down in Louisiana, we just call them bribes. But I suppose everything needs a fancier name inside the Beltway. The sight of her private hoard, her secret jokes, her own handwriting broadcast for the world to see. seemed to sever the last thread of Waters' self-control. With a guttural roar of fury, she lunged across the table toward Jerome, her hands clawed, her face a mask of pure hatred. "Traitor," she screeched, her voice a raw, shredded thing. "I'll destroy you." Two FBI agents moved instantly, stepping forward to intercept her. But they weren't needed. In her rage, she tripped on the hem of her own expensive suit. Her ankle twisted and she tumbled forward, not with the dramatic grace of a movie stunt, but with the clumsy, awkward finality of a falling statue. She went down hard, her head striking the corner of the witness table with a sickening thud. The room let out a collective gasp, but the true shock was not the fall itself. It was what the fall dislodged. Her wig, the towering, perfectly coiffed symbol of her authority and artifice, was knocked loose. It slid off her head and tumbled to the floor, landing with a soft, pathetic poof on the Senate seal woven into the carpet. It lay there like a dead thing, a small, furry creature that had been tragically struck down. The chamber was plunged into a moment of stunned absolute silence. Stripped of her magnificent hairpiece, the real Maxine Waters was revealed. Her own hair was thin and gray, patched with bald spots, the frail and vulnerable scalp of an old woman. The carefully constructed image of the powerful, ageless warrior queen was gone, literally knocked from her head. In its place was a tired, defeated, and shockingly ordinary person. "My wig," she whimpered, the sound barely audible. The Titan of Congress was on her hands and knees, crawling, scrambling across the floor like a desperate scavenger. "Give me my wig," she cried, her voice thick with a humiliation that was almost too painful to watch. As she crawled toward the fallen hairpiece, another figure moved. It was Chennai, her young press secretary, a woman who had idolized Waters, who had seen her as a mentor and a hero. Chennai bent down and picked up the wig. For a moment, it seemed she would return it, a small act of mercy to cover her boss's shame. Waters reached for it, her eyes pleading. "Chennai, eyes, please." But Chennai did not hand it back. Instead, she clutched the wig to her chest, turned, and with tears streaming down her face, she walked directly to Kennedy's table and sat down next to Jerome. "No," Waters whispered the word a puff of air. "Not you, too. Chennai's not my baby. I'm sorry, Auntie Maxine," Chennai said, her voice trembling but resolute, using the affectionate title that now sounded like an accusation. I can't be a part of the lies anymore. I can't do it." Kennedy gestured to her with a gentle, encouraging nod. "It's all right, young lady. Just tell us what you know." Chennai took a shaky breath, the wig still clutched in her lap like a bizarre security blanket. "The offshore accounts," she began. She thought it was a hilarious joke. She named them after civil rights icons. The room, which had thought it could not be shocked further, fell into an even deeper silence. "She has Rosa Parks LLC in the Bahamas," Chennai continued, the names tumbling out. "It holds over $3 million. There's an MLK investment trust in the Cayman Islands with almost $6 million and a Malcolm X holdings that she used for the money from Africa. She made me manage the transfers because she said computers were too complicated. I have the account numbers. Senator, I have the passwords. I have all of it." Kennedy turned his gaze back to Waters, who was still on the floor, propped up on her elbows, her face a grotesque mask of sweat, running makeup, and utter despair. There was no anger left in him, only a profound, almost sorrowful gravity. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room, "you named your money laundering fronts after Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. These were people who gave their lives for justice, for equality, for the very people you claim to represent. And you used their sacred names to hide money you stole from dictators and from your own community. Is there no line you wouldn't cross? Is there nothing sacred to you?" Waters didn't answer. She had given up trying to reattach her dignity. She simply knelt on the floor, clutching the broken handle of her gavel, her bald head exposed to the world. rocking back and forth in a silent rhythm of self-destruction. The powerful woman who had stormed into the room to annihilate a country lawyer was now a broken, wigless, weeping old woman, exposed and abandoned on the floor of the United States Senate. The image of Maxine Waters wigless and kneeling on the floor was an icon of utter collapse. The air in the room was heavy, not with triumph, but with the grim finality of a public execution. Her two remaining junior staffers, their faces pale with shock and pity, finally broke from their paralysis. They skewered forward and with awkward gentleness helped her to her feet and guided her back into her chair at the witness table. She slumped into it, a marionette with its strings cut. Someone tried to offer her the fallen wig, but she pushed it away, clutching the broken gavel handle to her chest as if it were the only solid thing left in her universe. Her makeup, stray with sweat and tears, created dark rivulets down her cheeks. The formidable matriarch was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shell. Senator Kennedy watched the pathetic scene unfold, giving her a moment to compose herself, a small final courtesy before delivering the next blow. He took a sip of water, the sound of him swallowing unnaturally loud in the silent chamber. "But wait," he said, his voice pulling the room's attention back to the methodical destruction at hand. "There's more." He gestured to the screens which had been displaying the offshore account details. "Let's bring the focus back home. Back to your district, the place you call your political home, even if you don't actually live there." New images flooded the screens. These were not financial documents, but something far more visceral. They were photographs from inside apartment buildings. Grim portraits of urban decay, peeling lead paint, angry black blossoms of toxic mold spreading across ceilings, kitchens teeming with cockroaches and overflowing toilets. The images were bleak, oppressive, and filled with a sense of profound neglect. "You own 17 residential properties in South Los Angeles," Kennedy stated, his voice cold and hard. "You own them, not in your own name, of course, but through a labyrinth of LLCs with deliberately anonymous names like Royal Properties and Crench Holdings. We trace them. They all lead back to you. You are, and I want this to be perfectly clear to everyone watching, one of the largest slumlords in your own congressional district." The accusation was stunning in its hypocrisy. The champion of the poor was herself a purveyor of squalor. Waters shook her head, a low moan escaping her lips. "You charge your tenants the maximum allowable rent under the Section 8 housing voucher program." Kennedy continued, his voice a relentless hammer of facts. "You take every penny of taxpayer money offered and in return you provide housing that is unfit for human habitation. You have city housing inspectors on your payroll, men who sign off on your building site unseen, ensuring you are never cited for the dozens of code violations in each property." A video began to play. The camera was shaky, clearly filmed on a smartphone. It showed a young mother, no older than 20, holding a small baby who was coughing weakly. They were standing in a kitchen where large patches of the ceiling were missing, revealing damp, rotting wood. "This is my apartment," the woman said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "I pay $2 a month. The money comes from my Section 8 voucher. The landlord is a company called Royal Properties LLC." She looked directly into the camera, her eyes pleading. "I found out that's owned by Congresswoman Maxine Waters. I've been begging them for 2 years to fix the mold. My baby has asthma. The doctor says it's from this apartment. Last winter, the heat was broken for a month. A whole month. We called every day. No one ever came. No one ever helped us." The video cut to another tenant, an elderly man leaning on a walker in a dark, dingy hallway. "The elevator's been broken for 6 months," he said, his voice raspy. "I live on the 4th floor. I have to crawl up the stairs. I told them. I begged them. They told me if I didn't like it, I could move." More videos followed, more tenants, more stories of misery and neglect. Each one a brutal indictment. The woman who railed against injustice on the national stage was herself a perpetrator of it in her own backyard. profiting from the suffering of the very people who had given her power. Waters had stopped rocking. She sat utterly still, her eyes fixed on the screen, watching the faces of her constituents as they detailed her cruelty. She had given up trying to reattach her wig. She clutched it to her chest like a dead pet, a bizarre talisman of her former glory. "Should we continue, Congresswoman?" Kennedy asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "Because we haven't even gotten to your husband's no-show consulting contracts with companies that needed favors from your committee. Or the $1 million in speaking fees you collected from foreign entities who were simultaneously lobbying you to kill sanctions legislation. Or the fundraisers where you charged the struggling churches in your own district thousands of dollars just to have you appear and speak." A single word escaped Waters's lips. A broken, desperate whisper. "Please." Kennedy leaned forward. "Please." "What, ma'am? Please stop." She breathed, the words barely audible. Kennedy's voice hardened, the last ounce of pity evaporating. "Did you stop when that mother begged you to fix the mold that was poisoning her child? Did you stop when that old man had to crawl up 4 flights of stairs? Did you stop when you were cashing the checks from the very people who were keeping your constituents in poverty? Did you stop stealing from the people who trusted you?" He stood up, his shadow falling over her. "In Louisiana, we have a saying, you can shear a sheep many times, but you can only skin it once. Ma'am, for 30 years, you haven't been shearing your sheep. You've been skinning them alive." The weight of Kennedy's final accusation, the image of her skinning her own flock, seemed to crush what little was left of Maxine Waters. She made a guttural choking sound, a noise of profound and absolute despair. Her body, already pushed to its limits, finally gave out. She began to hyperventilate, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. Her eyes, wide with terror, rolled back in her head. She fumbled in her oversized, expensive purse, her hands shaking so violently that she couldn't grasp the small bottle of blood pressure medication she was searching for. The contents of her purse spilled across the table. Lipstick, a gold-plated pen, a thick wad of $100 bills held together by a rubber band, and the elusive pill bottle which rolled off the edge and clattered to the floor. A paramedic who had been standing by in the ante-room rushed forward. "Ma'am, I need to check your vitals," he said, his voice calm but firm. "No," Waters gasped, trying to wave him away. I'm fine. I am Maxine Waters. I am." But she couldn't finish the sentence. Her own name, once a declaration of power, now sounded like a plea. The paramedic ignored her protests, expertly wrapping a blood pressure cuff around her arm. The digital monitor beeped, flashing a number that made the medic's eyes widen. 210/130. A hypertensive crisis. "Senator, we need to continue this," the paramedic said, looking at Kennedy. "But she needs immediate and constant monitoring. This is a stroke-level event." Kennedy nodded grimly. "We'll be as quick as we can." "Ma'am," he said, his voice softening slightly as they hooked her up to a portable EKG and a blood pressure monitor that would provide constant readings. "While the medical team is assisting you, let me tell you about your neighbors. Your real neighbors, not the ones in the district you pretend to live in, but your neighbors in Hancock Park." The screens which had been showing the faces of her suffering tenants now switched to a map of her opulent neighborhood with her mansion circled in red. "You know who lives just 3 doors down from your $4.5 million estate?" Kennedy asked. "The CEO of a predatory payday lending company. A man whose business model is to charge your constituents 400% interest, trapping them in a cycle of debt. 2 streets over is a hedge fund manager who made his fortune buying up distressed mortgages in South LA during the 2008 crisis and foreclosing on thousands of families. The very crisis you helped exacerbate." He let that sink in. "You didn't just leave your district, Congresswoman. You literally moved in with the enemy. You joined the very people who were preying on your voters. In Louisiana, we'd call that the height of hypocrisy. In Washington, I suppose you call it networking." Waters was now a prisoner of medical technology. Her every heartbeat and pressure spike displayed on a monitor for all to see. Her crooked wig sat on the table beside the broken gavel, a sad tableau of her shattered identity. But here's the part that truly boggles the mind. Kennedy continued, his voice laced with disbelief. It's not just that you used stolen money to buy a mansion. It's that you kept a fake apartment in your district. A prop, a stage set for your fraudulent life. New footage played on the screen. Security camera video from the entrance of the modest apartment building where Waters was officially registered to live. The time-lapse footage showed days, then weeks of inactivity, then suddenly, a flurry of motion, Waters arriving with her entourage, staying for an hour, and then leaving. The date stamp on the video corresponded with a community day event she had held for the media. You visit your own district like a foreign dignitary making a state visit, Kennedy observed, his voice dripping with contempt. 30 years in Congress, and you treat the people who elected you, who trusted you, like props in your political theater. At that precise moment, a new sound buzzed through the room. It was a new phone, a cheap burner model an aide had given her after she had smashed her first one. And in an almost unbelievable failure of foresight, it too had been connected to the display system. A new text message flashed onto the giant screens. It was from Sidney Williams' husband. The message was short, brutal, and devoid of any emotion. Maxine, my attorney has advised me to file for divorce immediately. He says it's the only way to protect my remaining assets. I can't go down with you on this. It's over. The final betrayal. The man whose finances she had protected. The man for whom she had risked everything. The man she had been married to for over 40 years was cutting her loose. The sound that tore from Maxine Waters' throat was not human. It was a primal scream of agony and abandonment. The sound of a soul being ripped in two. Sidney, she wailed, the name a raw open wound. Not you, not you, too. She tried to rise from her chair to run to escape the inescapable. But the medical wires held her fast. Her body convulsed and the blood pressure monitor began to beep in a frantic, high-pitched alarm. Ma'am, Kennedy said, his voice quiet but firm. Even your husband knows a sinking ship when he sees one. And speaking of sinking, let's talk about those Caribbean accounts. Rosa Parks LLC. Did you really think no one would ever find that? But Waters was no longer listening. She was lost in her own private hell, mumbling her husband's name over and over, her body trembling uncontrollably. I believe we need to take a longer recess, Kennedy announced, his face grim. The Congresswoman requires urgent medical attention. But before we do, I want every person in this room and every person watching at home to understand what we have witnessed today. He stood, turning to address the cameras directly, his voice ringing with authority. This is not about one corrupt politician. This is about a system that enabled her. A system that looked the other way for decades because she was politically useful. Maxine Waters spent a career telling the poor she was their champion. While she was robbing them blind, she turned the noble cause of civil rights into a personal cash machine. She twisted the promise of justice into just for us. He looked down at the now sobbing, broken woman being attended to by paramedics. When we return, he promised, his voice like flint, we will detail the foreign money, the payments from dictators, the blood money from tyrants who murdered their own people. Because for Maxine Waters, apparently stealing from the American people simply wasn't enough. They began to wheel her out on a gurney, her body too unstable to even sit in a wheelchair. As she passed, she tried one last time to invoke her famous mantra, her voice a pathetic, gurgling whisper, reclaiming my time. Kennedy leaned down slightly as she was wheeled past. No, ma'am, he replied softly for her ears only. Your time is up. Now it's the people's turn. 2 hours later, the doors to the committee room opened and they wheeled Maxine Waters back in. The spectacle of her return silenced the buzzing gallery. The transformation was absolute and horrifying. Gone was the warrior queen, the political titan, the revolutionary. In her place was a frail, Broken old woman swallowed by a hospital wheelchair. She was hooked up to a portable oxygen tank, a clear tube running to her nostrils. The magnificent wig was gone, replaced by a sterile blue surgical cap that starkly framed her pale, sweat-shin face. Her hands, which had once commanded rooms and pointed an accusation, were now secured with soft medical restraints to the arms of the chair. A precaution taken after she had, in a fit of delirium, tried to rip out the IV drip that fed sedatives into her veins. The room was now packed beyond capacity. Senators had abandoned other meetings. Staffers lined the walls, and every news outlet in the nation had a camera pointed at the witness table. They were all here for the final act, the complete and undeniable death of a political dynasty. Senator Kennedy stood as they positioned the wheelchair. His face was somber, devoid of any hint of triumph. He looked like a man performing a grim but necessary duty. "Congresswoman," he began, his voice gentle, "are you lucid enough to continue? You are, of course, free to invoke your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." From behind the oxygen mask, a muffled, raspy whisper emerged, picked up by the hypersensitive microphones. "I am Maxine Waters." "Yes, ma'am," Kennedy acknowledged sadly. "We know. Now, before the recess, we were discussing your international financial affairs. Let's talk about your friends. Specifically your friendships with some of the world's most brutal and corrupt tyrants." A new gallery of images appeared on the screens. They showed Waters over the years, smiling, shaking hands, and accepting awards from a who's who of international Paris. "Here you are with Jean-Bertrand Aristide of Haiti," Kennedy narrated, "a man driven from power amidst charges of rampant corruption and horrific human rights abuses. But just before he fled the country with millions, his government made a $200 donation to your Community Empowerment Fund. A coincidence, I'm sure." Another picture appeared, Waters beaming next to Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. "Mr. Mugabe," Kennedy said, his voice laced with ice, "responsible for the starvation and murder of thousands of his own people. But he still found the time to funnel $500,000 to your various foundations through a series of untraceable intermediaries." More photos flashed by, a sickening slideshow of her posing with dictators and warlords, each one linked to a documented payment. "But this one," Kennedy said, his voice dropping, "is my personal favorite." The screen showed Waters at a lavish banquet, clinking champagne glasses with General Moussa Camara of Guinea. "General Camara," Kennedy explained, "the man who ordered his soldiers to open fire on unarmed pro-democracy protesters in a stadium, murdering 157 people. The man whose troops systematically raped women in the streets as a tool of terror." "And what did you do, Congresswoman, when the United States government sanctioned this monster?" A video clip played, Waters at a press conference passionately defending General Camara, calling the sanctions a racist colonialist attack on a sovereign African leader. The clip ended and Kennedy's voice was thick with disgust. "You defended a mass murderer. You used your platform, the platform given to you by American voters, to protect a butcher because he was paying you. His blood-soaked regime transferred $1.3 million to your Malcolm X Holdings account in the Cayman Islands. The money he stole from his starving people went to finance your mansion, your cars, your diamonds." Waters's medical monitors began to beep erratically. Her eyes glazed with sedatives darted back and forth. Kennedy raised a hand. "Let's bring in our final witness." The doors opened again, and a man entered. He was a distinguished gay-haired African man with eyes that held an ocean of sorrow. "This is Dr. Emmanuel Adio," Kennedy announced. "He is a physician who runs free medical clinics in Guinea. Doctor, please tell the committee what you witnessed." Dr. Adio's voice was heavy with a pain that time had not healed. "I was there. I treated the victims of the stadium massacre. I held children in my arms as they died from gunshot wounds. I tried to stitch together women who had been brutalized by soldiers for hours. They died because we had no medicine, no bandages, no clean water. General Kamara had looted the national health budget. He turned his gaze from Kennedy and looked directly at the broken woman in the wheelchair. And then years later, I learned where that money went. The money for the medicine that could have saved those children. It went to you, Congresswoman Waters. Children died in my arms so you could wear a new watch. A low animalistic moan came from behind Waters's oxygen mask. She tried to speak to form a defense, but all that came out was a garbled mumble. For the people. Which people? Dr. Audio asked, his voice breaking with emotion. The children I buried, the women whose lives were destroyed. Or your people, your family, your friends? Kennedy stood. Thank you, doctor. You may step down. He turned to face Waters. His final judgment at hand. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, what we have seen here today is a betrayal of public trust so profound it is difficult to articulate. His voice began to rise, a crescendo of righteous fury, stealing from the poor while pretending to be their savior, enriching her family while her constituents lived in squalor, taking blood money from murderers and tyrants, perverting the legacy of the civil rights movement for personal gain, numbing her criminal enterprises after heroes who died for justice. Otter made one last pathetic attempt to reclaim her power. She tried to push herself up from the wheelchair. I am the resistance, she croaked, but as she put weight on her legs, they buckled. She pitched forward, pulling the IV stand with her, sending monitors crashing to the floor in a cacophony of shattering plastic and blaring alarms. In the chaos, as paramedics rushed to her, she managed to grab a fallen microphone. This is racism, she rasped into it. This is Trump's revenge. Kennedy looked down at her sadly. Ma'am, this has nothing to do with President Trump. This is about your victims. The mother whose child you poisoned with lead paint. The old man you forced to crawl up the stairs. The children in Guinea who died for your greed. As they lifted her onto a gurney, she tried to sing the great anthem of her generation. We shall overcome. But her voice was a broken, tuneless croak. No one joined in. The gallery was silent. This committee, Kennedy announced, his voice booming through the silent room, will be making a formal criminal referral to the Department of Justice on the following charges: racketeering, conspiracy to defraud the United States, money laundering, wire fraud, tax evasion, bribery, violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, violations of the Fair Housing Act. The list went on and on, each charge a nail in the coffin of her career. As they wheeled her out for the last time, her final, barely coherent words were picked up by the microphone she still clutched. Auntie Maxine, for the people. Kennedy watched her go, then spoke softly into his own microphone. No, ma'am, you were for yourself, always and only for yourself. He then looked directly into the cameras. His job done. In Louisiana, we have a saying, the chickens always come home to roost. For 30 years, Maxine Waters's chickens of corruption and greed have been flying free. Today, every last one of them came home. Within hours, the fallout was apocalyptic. The #Maxine meltdown was the #1 trend worldwide. FBI agents raided her homes and offices. Her husband's divorce filing was made public. The Congressional Black Caucus voted unanimously to expel her. In her hospital room under federal guard, Maxine Waters watched her world burn. Every channel, every pundit, every former ally condemned her. As the sedatives finally pulled her under, her last conscious thought was a question that had never once crossed her mind in 40 years of power. How did that simple country lawyer from Louisiana ever beat me? The answer was simple. He had the truth, and in the end, the truth is the only gavel that matters. If you believe that truth and accountability are what we need more of, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story because the fight for justice is far from over.